to our next session, which is a more kind of dialogue-oriented session. I want to say we're actually called Livable Income for Equality, but even our own members sometimes call ourselves Livable Income for Everyone. So it's a mistake that often gets made, and in fact we want both things. We want a livable income for equality and for everyone. We have been starting from the moment, the opening yesterday, to debate a question, I think, in this conference, and that is whether in advocating for a basic income, or as we like to call it at Life, a guaranteed livable income, we should be talking about the why, or we should be talking about the how. And in my presentation today, I'm not going to talk a lot about our specific strategies. I'm leaving that to our next presentation. I'm going to talk a lot about the why, and that's because I think that the why and the how actually can be separated from each other. That we get to a how because we first of all answer what we're trying to achieve with a guaranteed income, what problems we're trying to address, and what we want to do with a guaranteed income. And there's so many possibilities of how, and evaluating them becomes difficult without a clear answer to why. So Life is a relatively new group, but it's a group of fairly seasoned activists. We come from a number of organizations that were already existing in Vancouver. A whole bunch of us were previously working in an organization that is operated through a feminist collective running a battered women's shelter and a rape crisis center. It's the oldest rape crisis center in the country. And the battered women's shelter, or we'd say transition house, has been around since the early 1980s. And part of the reason that for those of us who've done that work, we're very interested in a guaranteed livable income is that we've seen how decimated the welfare state has become and how much pressure that has put on the feminist organizing that we're trying to do, as well as on the individual women who are trying to leave abusive men. So in just like in the US context, in Canada, in many different provinces, there have been major cuts to cash assistance in particular, as well as other welfare state programs. Starting in the 1980s, but really ramping up through the 90s and coming into some really serious effects in the early 2000s. And in particular with welfare, with cash assistance, what we're seeing is that the level of steps needed for applying has become onerous. There's multiple appointments, multiple forms, online, in person, handwritten, all kinds of documentation has to be provided. They're basically just kind of preventing people from even getting on in the first place. And then the amount of money available is extremely low, just incredibly low rates, reduced. There's been some tiny raises, but very minimal, and really not meeting the cost of living by any stretch. And this is and there's a lot of pressure to get off immediately, constant pressure to be looking for work and to only be on for a short period of time. And so for women leaving abusive men and coming into the transition house, this is putting an enormous amount of pressure on them. The application itself is pressure. It's acting as a pressure to tolerate, in some senses, the situations of violence in which they live, and it's putting them in further risk as a result and making it much harder for them to live. Others of us who joined Life came from a fundraising group, a group that is actually made up mostly of men who've agreed to fundraise money from the community for the feminist collective. And that's largely to do with another side of the welfare state, which is equality-seeking organizations have always found it hard to have a secure source of income from the state and have needed to develop their own independent sources of income, because oftentimes the kind of methods by which those state contracts are delivered or the kinds of requirements in them don't actually meet the equality-seeking mandates of the organizations that are trying to get those contracts. And so many of these people not only recognize the importance of an autonomous source of income for individuals, but also for politically active groups. And still others of us in Life have lived on welfare, are living on welfare, are working in the low-wage economy. And others still are organized in a coalition primarily of Asian women who are opposing the prostitution of Asian women, and Asian women are much overrepresented in prostitution, certainly on the west coast of the US and Canada and probably many other places too. So these are the kinds of political roots, effectively, and this is the perspectives that we come into this organizing with, which means that inequality is really central to our sense of why a GLI. And we call it a guaranteed livable income, which I'll get into in a minute. But we see that there are these multiple interlocking forms of inequality, that in effect poverty is not the only issue, but there's fundamentally class, race, and sex inequalities in the labor market, where we see low-wage labor primarily done by women and people of color. And we hope that a GLI would give people the option to refuse work conditions that they currently don't have the option to refuse. We see that those inequalities are extended, particularly in Canada, through programs like the Live-In Caregiver Program and 2-year temporary work permits, in which we start to rely on people overseas to come to Canada to do very insecure, often low-wage labor, sometimes without any route to citizenship. And we don't want to see a GLI implemented that would continue these conditions. We want a GLI that will not continue to look offshore for sources of cheap labor, and that would be available to residents, so that people who are coming to Canada, who are applying for citizenship or refugee status, for example, or are coming for other reasons where they have received permits to be in Canada, there's no reason that they should be refused state benefits, and we don't want to continue that unequal system either. There are other inequalities that affect women disproportionately. These inequalities, such as sexual harassment on the job, battery, rape, incest, prostitution, they include these, as well as the fact that women do the majority of the world's care work, and in fact are the majority of the welfare recipients in both Canada and the US. So we want a GLI to interrupt these conditions. Now, a GLI is not going to resolve all of these issues. It's not going to solve all these issues of inequality. But what it can fundamentally do is give people the option to refuse conditions that are exploitative of them. It can give people more choice, more autonomy over how they spend, what relations they seek out, what kind of work they seek out, how they spend their time as well. Time is fundamentally unequally divided in our society, and something that a GLI can do is kind of redirect that. Give people who right now run from job to job, from job to daycare, to maybe food banks or other kind of places where they can get things for cheap or free, often on public transit. The life of people living in poverty is harried, and GLI can offer time. So all of these things mean that what we think a GLI should look like is that it should be individual, it should be universal, it should be indexed to the cost of living, and it should be an amount of money that meets the cost of living without requirement to work. So we think that without these measures, the measures I've just said, that a GLI could be a prop to an unfair labor market. It may mean that if we institute this kind of a guaranteed livable income, that we would need additional price controls, such as on rent. And we don't want to see the rest of the welfare state dismantled. Public health care, public education, public transportation. In Canada, we're increasingly talking about a public childcare system. These are other elements that support equality as well. And we want to see these continue at the same time as we implement a guaranteed livable income. A lot of people, we encountered a lot of issues as we're organizing in Vancouver. We find that in particular, formations on the left find it difficult to engage with the idea of a guaranteed livable income. I wouldn't say this is true of every individual, but there are groups organized for better minimum wages, better welfare rates, and oftentimes they see the idea of a guaranteed livable income as a kind of threat, that they worry that as a result of implementing a guaranteed livable income, we may end up with a diminished welfare state, for example. But we really don't see this as an issue. I mean, it depends on, of course, how you organize your campaign. But in addition, you know, without a GLI, we have seen really significant cuts to the welfare state. And further, that this campaign itself has the possibility to reignite this idea that we as a society there's a benefit to us sharing our resources to a much greater extent than we currently do. And that in running a campaign that is supporting a guaranteed livable income, we can promote that idea that we as a society ought to be and should be, and all of us can benefit from this, from sharing of resources in many different forms. And we really see that instituting this bigger conversation in the society can actually be a prop to the welfare state in a way that we don't have currently, because we've been living under this regime of basically cutbacks for quite a few years now. So we see that striving for a guaranteed livable income definitely should not mean striving for greater individualism, but rather it should encapsulate the idea of a society of shared fate, an idea that will help us to promote the expansion rather than the retraction of those institutions and services that spread opportunity and security more broadly across the society. The very idea of a guaranteed livable income, as I've outlined it, is so contrary to the idea of the individual wealth hoarding that is prominent in our current society, that we believe that agitating and debating, promoting, and ultimately achieving this vision will help to promote other important ideas like collective effort, resource sharing, and shared opportunity. And we believe also that this is an important step for us to take to work against the dominant narratives of individualism, competition, and wealth for the few that we find throughout our society now.